The room still smelled of lilies, the kind people bring to funerals, but that never truly masked the scent of loss. I sat by the window, staring at the street, but not really seeing anything. Losing my father felt like someone had carved a hollow space inside me, one too wide to ever fill. I kept replaying the years of his illness, the way cancer slowly stripped away the man who once seemed invincible. I could still feel the antiseptic clinging to my skin from hospital visits. And of course, this wasn't my first time with grief. My mother had been gone for a decade now, taken in a single brutal instant. Nights stretched endlessly, and I cried without meaning to. Some mornings I couldn't even lift a spoon, watching my coffee grow cold while I sat in silence. Friends reached out, voices soft and careful, but their words never made it past the barrier I built around myself. I felt drained, not just by the loss itself, but by the years of bracing for it. Every step I took was like dragging chains behind me. Still, there was something buried beneath the grief, something I hated myself for even sensing. It came a few weeks later, folded into a crisp white envelope. I opened it with shaking hands, reading line after line until my chest tightened. $2 million, left to me by my father. My first reaction wasn't joy, but a sharp, shameful breath of relief. Relief. How could I feel that? My friend's words replayed in my mind. You can grieve and still breathe. The money doesn't erase him. But all I felt was the sting of guilt, caught between the depth of my loss and the faint, terrifying thought that maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one evening, the envelope still there, as if daring me to look at it again. The numbers on those papers didn't feel real, almost like they belonged to someone else's life. I traced my fingers over my father's signature, feeling the weight of his absence pressing down harder than the gift he'd left me. It wasn't about money. It was about what it symbolized. He'd worked his whole life to make sure I would be safe, and now I had to face that reality without him by my side. That truth cut deeper than anything. Some nights I caught myself whispering to the empty room, half expecting his voice to answer me back. I wanted to hear his laugh, the way he always made problems feel lighter, just by being in the same space. Instead, all I had was silence, and that silence was deafening. There were times I wished I could trade the inheritance for one more conversation, one more Sunday dinner with him at the head of the table. But wishes are cruel things when you're grieving. They remind you of everything you can't change. When a friend stopped by, she placed a hand on mine and said softly, "You can grieve and still breathe, Rebecca. The money doesn't erase him." I nodded, but inside I wanted to scream. How could I breathe when it felt like my entire chest had collapsed? Yet part of me knew she was right. I couldn't stay frozen in this space forever. The guilt was eating me alive, and I needed to find a way to carry both truths. The pain of losing him and the small spark of relief that I wouldn't drown completely in the aftermath. I tried to slip back into the rhythms of daily life, but everything felt like moving through water. I went back to making coffee in the mornings, folding laundry, even going for short walks, though the world around me felt strangely muted. People laughed on sidewalks, children ran across yards, and I kept wondering how life could keep going so normally when mine felt so shattered. Every small task was both a reminder of what I'd lost and a fragile attempt at reclaiming myself. Sometimes I caught myself standing in front of the mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back. She looked tired, older, like she had lived 3 lifetimes in just a few months. But there was also something else in her eyes, something that scared me at first, a flicker of determination. As numb as I felt, I knew I couldn't keep floating in grief forever. My father wouldn't have wanted me to stop living. He used to tell me, "Even in the darkest days, find something that makes you feel alive." His words echoed louder with each passing day, so I pushed myself, one tiny step at a time. I started answering phone calls again, even if my voice trembled. I let myself cry at night, but in the mornings I forced myself to open the curtains and let the sunlight in. It was fragile, shaky, and incomplete, but it was something. I told myself I could rebuild piece by piece, though I had no idea how fragile that hope would soon prove to be, or how quickly it could all be shattered at a kitchen table not long after. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of day that should have passed without notice. I walked into the kitchen still half asleep, expecting the smell of coffee or maybe just silence. Instead, I saw Ethan sitting at the table with a folder in front of him. He looked like a man rehearsing a speech, eyes fixed on the papers as if they might give him courage. My stomach tightened before he even spoke. I knew somehow that whatever this was, it wouldn't be ordinary. He asked me to sit, his voice flat, almost too controlled. I remember the way my chair scraped against the tile when I pulled it out, the sound echoing louder than it should have. "We need to talk," he said, and those 4 words felt heavier than the coffin I had buried my father in just weeks before. My heart pounded, a drumbeat against my ribs, as he opened the folder and pushed it toward me. His hands were trembling, but his face was stone. Then he said it. "I don't think we're happy anymore. I want a divorce." For a moment, I thought I misheard him, that maybe the grief had made me delirious. But the papers in front of me erased any doubt. Divorce. That word cut through me sharper than any scalpel ever could. My voice cracked when I answered, "What? But what about us? I thought we were okay." My chest burned as if I'd swallowed fire, but all I got in return was the steady shaking of his head. Ethan wouldn't look at me. His eyes darted anywhere but mine, like the cracks in the wall or the steam curling from my untouched mug. "We haven't been okay for a long time," he muttered, his voice trembling just enough to betray him. "This is best for both of us. Just sign." He slid the pen across the table as though this was just another bill to settle, nothing more. I felt the air leave my lungs, replaced by a crushing weight that made it hard to even swallow. I reached for his hand, desperate, trembling myself. "Please," I whispered, my throat raw. "Let's try counseling. Give us one more chance." The tears came fast, hot against my cheeks, blurring his face. I thought I saw a flicker of doubt cross his expression, a crack in the armor he'd built. But then he pulled his hand back, clutching it to his chest like my touch had burned him. That recoil hurt worse than the words themselves. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, but there was no softness there. "No," he said, shaking his head, voice breaking as if he'd rehearsed this moment over and over. "It's over. Please just sign. Half the assets, split the house. It's easier." Easier. The word clanged in my ears, insulting in its simplicity. How could he call it easy when it was tearing my life apart? My chest heaved, torn between begging more and walking away, but I couldn't seem to do either. My vision blurred as I stared down at the papers, each line of legal jargon twisting like a knife. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold the pen. I wanted to scream, to slam the folder shut and demand he fight for us instead of handing me an exit wound disguised as a contract. But I was exhausted. From grief, from the weight of carrying 2 losses in one lifetime. My strength had been scraped thin, and Ethan knew it. That's why he chose now. With a shaky breath, I signed. My name sprawled across the lines that would sever not just our marriage, but half of everything I had left. In the small print, hidden in the legalese I barely processed, was the cruelest cut of all. My inheritance, folded neatly into the marital assets category. $2 million, my father's final sacrifice, now split in half with the man walking away from me. I wanted to rip the pages apart, but my hand was too weak to resist. When I pushed the folder back to him, Ethan exhaled like a man freed from chains, while I felt mine tighten. The house around me suddenly felt foreign, the walls tilting with betrayal. He gathered the papers quickly, not daring to linger, and left me sitting at the table alone. The silence after the door shut was unbearable, a kind of quiet that wasn't peace, but a reminder. I had just lost my father, and now I had lost my husband too. What I didn't know then was that this wasn't just a divorce. It was the beginning of something far darker. The days after Ethan left blurred together, each one bleeding into the next like a watercolor left out in the rain. I stopped cooking, stopped opening the curtains, stopped answering the phone. Food lost its taste, time lost its shape. I slept through mornings and afternoons, not because I was rested, but because sleep was the only place I didn't feel the crushing weight of absence. My father's voice was gone, my husband's footsteps were gone, and all I had left was silence. That silence became poisonous. It lingered in the corners of the house, pressing against me until it felt like I was suffocating. I'd sit on the couch for hours, staring at nothing, only to realize the sun had set and I hadn't moved all day. Friends left messages I never returned. My sister called, her voice pleading through the static. "Get up, Beck. Go for a walk. You can't live like this." But I couldn't even find the will to stand. Moving felt pointless when everything I had loved had already slipped through my fingers. One night I caught sight of myself in the mirror, hair tangled, eyes sunken, and I barely recognized the woman looking back. I whispered to her, "I don't want to be the woman who failed at love twice." The words cut me open. My father had trusted me with his life's work, and Ethan had taken half of it as though it was his right. The thought hollowed me out further. 2 men I loved, one gone to death, the other gone by choice, and both had left me empty. The house felt like a museum of loss. Every room held reminders I couldn't escape. My father's old watch on the dresser, the chair where Ethan used to sit, the photographs that mocked me with frozen smiles. I stopped dusting, stopped folding laundry, stopped caring if dishes piled up in the sink. It was as if the house itself was decaying along with me, collapsing under the weight of everything I refused to touch. I thought if I ignored it long enough, maybe it would all just disappear. But grief doesn't vanish. It festers. Nights were the worst, when shadows stretched across the ceiling like accusations. I'd curl under the blanket, clutching my father's scarf just to feel something familiar against my skin. My body ached with fatigue, but my mind wouldn't rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face across that kitchen table, heard his voice breaking as he asked me to sign away not just our marriage, but half of my inheritance. I replayed it until the memory became unbearable, until it burned itself into me. My sister tried to break through the fog. "Becky, listen to me," she said one night over the phone, her voice sharp with desperation. "You're letting him win twice, once by leaving you, and again by destroying you. Don't give him that power." Her words should have sparked something in me, but instead I sat there in silence, staring at the floor. Because deep down, I wondered if she was wrong. What if he hadn't destroyed me at all? What if I was just already broken? I kept asking myself the same question in the quiet hours. How did I get here? How did I go from being a daughter, a wife, a woman with a future, to this hollow shell curled up on the couch? I traced the memories back like threads unraveling. Losing my mother had taught me how fragile life could be. Losing my father reminded me how cruel it could become. And losing Ethan, well, that was different. That was betrayal disguised as honesty, a wound that kept reopening. I blamed myself for not seeing the signs, for missing the cracks in our marriage that he claimed were there all along. Maybe I had been blind, too focused on keeping my father comfortable in his final years to notice Ethan drifting away. The guilt clawed at me, whispering that I had failed as a wife, just as I had failed to hold on to the 2 men who had defined so much of my life. It was a vicious loop, one I couldn't escape no matter how many times I tried to silence it. But even in the darkest corners of that despair, a spark of something else flickered. Anger. Small, faint, almost unrecognizable at first, but there. Every time I thought about Ethan's relief when I signed those papers, or the cold way he slid the folder across the table, that spark grew hotter. I didn't know it yet, but that ember would become the fire I needed. For now, though, I was still lost, still sinking. I had no idea that one accidental glance, weeks later, would change everything. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon. I'd dragged myself out of the house, convincing myself that picking up takeout counted as progress. The drive-through line was long, the kind of mundane wait that usually numbed my thoughts. But then, through the windshield, I saw him. Ethan. He was standing across the street, laughing in a way I hadn't heard from him in years. My chest tightened as my eyes followed his every move, and that's when I saw her, the woman leaning in close, the one who kissed him like she already owned him. At first, my mind refused to accept it. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened, as if holding on could anchor me in place. But the truth was undeniable. I recognized her. She wasn't a stranger. She was his ex. The very woman he had sworn was nothing more than a closed chapter in his past. Watching them together was like reliving the divorce all over again, only this time it came with a dagger twisting in my chest. I almost opened the car door, ready to cross the street and demand answers. But my body froze, locked in a silent battle between rage and humiliation. Instead, I sat there, hidden behind glass, watching their laughter pierce the quiet ruin of my life. My food order came and went. I barely noticed. What burned deeper than betrayal was the clarity that came with it. Ethan hadn't just left me. He had walked straight back into her arms, and suddenly, every detail of our marriage, the timing, the coldness, the urgency, screamed of something far more calculated. When I got home, the house felt even colder than usual. I dropped the bag of food on the counter, untouched, my appetite smothered by what I'd seen. My chest was still tight, my mind replaying that kiss like a cruel loop. I paced the kitchen, trying to breathe, when my eyes landed on something out of place. Ethan's old laptop. He must have left it behind in his rush to move out. For a moment, I just stared at it, heart hammering, torn between leaving it closed and opening the door to truths I might not be ready for. I told myself I only needed a distraction, something to quiet the storm in my head. But the second I pressed the power button and saw his name flash on the login screen, my pulse spiked. The desktop opened automatically, no password required, and there it was, a small red notification in the corner. New emails. I froze. This was trespassing, wrong in a dozen ways. But after everything he had taken from me, was I really going to let a blinking icon stop me? My hands trembled as I clicked it open. Hundreds of messages filled the inbox, but the most recent ones glared like neon signs. Hotel bookings, short-coded notes, payment confirmations. One subject line made my stomach turn. Wait until inheritance clears. Another. Split after probate. My throat closed as I read them aloud in a whisper, each word cutting deeper than the last. In that moment, the truth slammed into me like a tidal wave. Ethan and his ex hadn't just fallen back into each other. They had planned this, down to the last cruel detail. I sat frozen, staring at the screen as the emails blurred together. Line after line confirmed what I already feared but hadn't dared to admit. They had been plotting for months, weaving my father's death into their timetable like it was some financial strategy. My hands went cold as I scrolled further, finding receipts for dinners, calendars marked with secret rendezvous, even messages joking about me being too distracted with grief to notice. It wasn't just betrayal, it was cruelty dressed in calculation. A sound escaped me, somewhere between a sob and a growl. I slammed the laptop shut and pressed my palms against my eyes, but the images wouldn't fade. My marriage hadn't ended because of unhappiness or drifting apart. It ended because Ethan and his ex had been waiting for my father to die, for the inheritance to land, for the perfect moment to gut me and walk away with half. The kind of precision only a conspiracy could hold. I thought grief had emptied me, but this revelation lit something else entirely. Rage. Hot, steady, and undeniable. For the first time in weeks, I felt awake, my veins humming with something other than sorrow. They thought I would remain broken, drowning in silence. They thought wrong. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew this much. They had built their scheme on the idea that I was weak, and that mistake would cost them everything. The shock faded quickly, replaced by something sharper, steadier. I reopened the laptop with deliberate hands, no longer trembling, and began saving everything I could find. Each email, each receipt, each hotel confirmation, I copied them, time-stamped them, and printed physical records. Page after page, I laid their betrayal bare, watching it transform from heartbreak into evidence. It was almost mechanical, the way I moved, but underneath it all, my anger pulsed like a drumbeat, reminding me that this wasn't just pain anymore. It was fuel. I called Claire, my best friend, and when she heard my voice, she immediately knew something had shifted. "Becky, what's going on?" she asked, cautious but firm. I told her everything. my words tumbling out in a rush, the emails, the plans, the proof that Ethan and his ex had waited like vultures for my father's death. Saying it aloud felt both damning and liberating, like ripping the cover off a festering wound. Silence stretched on her end before she finally breathed. That's theft by deception. You can fight this. For the first time in weeks, I didn't sound broken when I answered. I'm going to make sure they lose what they tried to steal, I told her, my voice low and steady. I don't want petty revenge. I want the truth out, and I want them held accountable. Claire didn't try to soothe me or tell me to calm down. She simply said, "Then let's do this right." And in that moment, something inside me clicked into place. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was planning. The next morning, I spread the documents across my dining table like puzzle pieces. Each receipt, each email, each hotel booking carried its own weight, but together they painted the clearest picture of betrayal I had ever seen. It was no longer just a story of a failed marriage. It was a conspiracy. I highlighted dates, cross-checked payments, and started creating a timeline that showed how Ethan's sudden urgency for divorce lined up perfectly with the inheritance clearing. Piece by piece, the truth was undeniable. I wasn't reckless about it, though. Grief had made me fragile, but anger made me sharp. I bought an external drive and copied every file, labeling them carefully. I stored one set at home, another in a safe deposit box, because I knew Ethan well enough to expect he'd try to erase the trail if he discovered what I had. This wasn't about lashing out. It was about being smarter, steadier, and above all, prepared. When I looked at the growing stack of evidence, I felt something new stirring inside me, a sense of control I hadn't felt in months. Ethan had counted on me collapsing, on me being too broken to fight. But here I was, sitting taller, my pen scratching across the page as I built the case against him. For the first time since my father's funeral, I didn't feel powerless. I felt dangerous. And that terrified part of me that once thought I was broken began to fade. That evening, I sat across from Claire at her kitchen table, the evidence stacked between us like ammunition. She flipped through the pages, her eyes widening with every line she read. "This isn't just betrayal, Becky," she said finally, setting the papers down. "It's calculated theft. He and that woman plotted to gut you at your weakest." Hearing her say it out loud solidified what I already knew. This wasn't just personal. It was criminal. I felt a strange calm wash over me, the kind that comes when chaos suddenly takes shape. "Then I won't just grieve him," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "I'll expose him. I'll expose them both." Claire nodded, her face fierce, as if she was ready to fight right alongside me. For years, Ethan had underestimated me, treating my kindness as weakness. Now I was going to make him realize just how wrong he had been. As I tucked the evidence back into folders, I thought of my father. He had built his life on honesty, on hard work, on protecting the people he loved. Ethan had twisted that legacy into a payday. But I wasn't going to let my father's memory be tainted by their greed. I promised myself then and there. I would fight, not just for the money, but for justice. And that promise lit a fire inside me that was only just beginning to burn. Walking into the lawyer's office, I felt my pulse in my throat. My folder of evidence was clutched so tightly under my arm that the edges bent. The walls smelled faintly of leather and old books, the kind of place where battles weren't fought with fists, but with paper and signatures. I laid everything out on the polished desk, emails, receipts, the timeline, and waited as he scanned through them. His brows furrowed deeper with every page, until finally he leaned back in his chair and said, "Rebecca, this isn't just messy. This is fraud." For a moment, hearing it framed in legal terms made it more real, heavier. He explained my options with a calm, deliberate tone. A civil suit to reverse the settlement on grounds of fraud and concealment, and the possibility of criminal charges if we referred Ethan's actions to the prosecutor. My heart raced as he spoke, because for the first time, the possibility of justice didn't feel abstract. It felt tangible. It felt like something I could reach for. I took a slow breath before answering, steadying the fire inside me. "Do both," I told him, my voice low but certain. He targeted my inheritance. He plotted with her. Prove the conspiracy, and then let the law do the rest. The lawyer nodded, already making notes, already preparing the path ahead. And as I watched him gather the papers into neat piles, a quiet realization settled over me. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the truth, for my father's memory, and for every woman who had ever been left bleeding in the shadow of betrayal. The lawyer brought in a forensic accountant, a man with sharp eyes and an even sharper pencil. He combed through the records with a precision that made me both nervous and hopeful. Within days, he uncovered more than I ever imagined. Ethan had been siphoning joint funds for months, forging small signatures on minor documents, even inflating expense claims at his job. Each discovery was another thread unraveling the image of the man I once thought I knew. What I had taken as carelessness was, in reality, a pattern of deception. Sitting in that office, listening to them connect the dots, I felt both sick and vindicated. Part of me wanted to crawl out of my own skin, ashamed for not seeing it sooner. But another part, the stronger part, leaned in and took notes. Every lie he had told, every receipt he had hidden, was becoming evidence. And the accountant's calm voice only made the storm inside me burn hotter. "He left a trail," he said matter-of-factly, "and trails can be followed." I thought of Ethan and his ex, smug in their secrecy, believing their coded emails and whispered plans would stay buried. They hadn't counted on me fighting back, and they certainly hadn't counted on me being smarter than their lies. With each new piece of proof, the ground shifted under them, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks turned into a collapse. By the time we filed the civil suit, I felt a strange calmness, like stepping into a storm I had finally learned how to navigate. My lawyer drafted subpoenas, and I authorized every one of them. Discovery would force Ethan's lies into daylight, and I wanted every corner of their scheme exposed. But it wasn't enough for me that the courts knew. Their betrayal had been so calculated, so vicious, that silence felt like complicity. That's when my lawyer suggested something bold, leaking key facts to the press. At first, the idea terrified me. The thought of my private pain plastered across headlines made my stomach twist. But then I pictured Ethan's smug smile, the way he sighed with relief when I signed those papers, and the fear turned into determination. "If the world needs to know who he really is, then let them," I said, my voice steady. "He doesn't get to hide behind lies anymore." My lawyer nodded, promising to keep it measured, controlled, undeniable. So the plan was set. The courts would see the fraud, the prosecutors would see the crimes, and the public would see the truth. I left the office that day with the weight of my father's watch on my wrist, a reminder of the man who built his life on integrity. Ethan had gambled that grief would make me weak, but grief had made me sharper, stronger, and now his downfall was already in motion. The courtroom felt colder than I expected, every word echoing against walls that seemed built to amplify tension. Ethan sat across from me, his suit pressed, his jaw clenched, pretending to be the picture of composure. But I saw the flicker in his eyes every time our lawyer placed another piece of evidence on the table. Emails, hotel records, receipts, each one stripping away his facade. His ex sat beside him, arms folded tight, lips pressed thin, as if denial could shield her from the truth unraveling in front of everyone. When I was called to testify, my hands shook only for a moment before steadying. I looked at Ethan, no longer through the eyes of a wife, but through the eyes of someone who had been hunted. My voice didn't waver as I told the court how he had asked for divorce weeks after my father's funeral, how he insisted on splitting everything when he knew exactly what my inheritance meant. And when the judge asked if I believed this was intentional, I answered clearly, "Yes, they planned it." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of papers shuffling and the weight of the judge's pen against the docket. Ethan tried to argue, tried to paint himself as a husband who simply fell out of love. But then the accountant's report was presented. The forged signatures, the falsified expenses, the timeline that matched too perfectly with my father's death. With each revelation, I saw Ethan shrink a little more, the confident man I once loved replaced by someone small, cornered, and exposed. When it was his turn to speak, Ethan's voice cracked under the weight of his own lies. I thought we were drifting, he stammered, glancing nervously at the judge, then at me. I didn't plan, but the words sounded hollow, collapsing under the mountain of proof stacked against him. His ex shifted uncomfortably beside him, her face pale, her eyes darting toward the gallery where whispers rippled like wildfire. Whatever image she thought she had built of herself, it was unraveling before the very people she once sought to impress. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but cutting. You called it an opportunity, Ethan. You called my grief a timetable. Did you ever love me? The words hung in the air, sharp as glass. For a moment, he couldn't meet my eyes, and when he finally did, there was no defense left, only a shadow of shame. The judge's gavel struck once, silencing the murmurs, but the damage to Ethan's facade was already done. The ruling came swiftly. The court rescinded parts of the settlement, awarding me control over the disputed assets and recognizing the fraud that had poisoned our divorce. At the same time, the prosecutor announced an inquiry into Ethan's falsified expense claims at work, charges that could follow him far beyond this courtroom. As the judge's decision was read aloud, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, not triumphant but steady, like a foundation finally rebuilt. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was justice. When the gavel fell for the final time, Ethan slumped in his chair like a man who had just realized the walls had caved in. His lawyer whispered frantically, but there was no salvaging the wreckage. Word spread quickly about the fraud, the affair, the stolen inheritance. And soon his job followed. He was suspended pending investigation, and the woman who once clung to his side slipped quietly out of the courtroom, her reputation crumbling with every whispered headline. I didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in watching someone implode, only a sober acknowledgement that the truth had finally caught up with them. Still, as I walked out of that courtroom, a weight I'd carried for months began to lift. My father's memory was no longer tethered to Ethan's greed, and I had taken back control of what he tried to steal. Justice wasn't neat, but it was enough. It was the line drawn between what they tried to do and what I refused to allow. Claire met me outside, tears in her eyes as she pulled me into a hug. You did it, she whispered. You got justice. I held on to her tightly, my voice steady when I answered, not just for me, for every woman who shouldn't be taken advantage of in her grief. And in that moment, standing beneath the wide sky with the courthouse doors behind me, I knew I had finally turned the page. The fight was over. My life was waiting. Months later, the world looked different. Not brighter overnight, not magically healed, but softer, lighter, like the air after a storm finally clears. Therapy became my anchor, guiding me through the maze of grief and betrayal until I could finally breathe without that crushing weight on my chest. I started cooking again, simple meals at first, letting the smell of garlic and onions fill my kitchen with life. I tore down old curtains, painted the walls, and planted a rose garden in the backyard. My father always said roses brought life back into any home, and for the first time I understood what he meant. Mornings no longer felt like a punishment. I'd wake up, open the curtains, and let the sun pour in without flinching. Some days were harder than others, but even in the hard ones, I no longer felt broken. I felt human again. Friends noticed the change, the way laughter started to creep back into my voice, the way I no longer carried my anger like armor. I had fought, I had survived, and slowly, I was beginning to live. One Sunday, I walked through the quiet cemetery with flowers in hand. Kneeling at my father's grave, I traced the letters of his name with my fingertips. You always told me life was meant to be beautiful, no matter how much pain tried to steal it away, I whispered. I lost my way for a while, Dad, but now, I'm living again. For you. For me. As I stood and walked back into the sunlight, I felt it, the peace I thought I'd never find. The storm had passed, and what remained was mine to build.